In this episode, we take a careful look at a control that sits right in the path of many modern attacks, the web application firewall. A lot of new learners hear the word firewall and picture a simple on or off barrier. But this kind of firewall is more like a security assistant that watches conversations between web users and the application, looking for patterns that should not be there. The goal is not to replace secure coding or good configuration, because no single tool can do that, but to add a strong defensive layer where web traffic enters your environment. Because payment environments often rely on web checkout pages, portals, and exposed APIs, the web layer is a frequent target, and small weaknesses can be probed thousands of times a day. By the time you finish listening, you should be able to explain what a web application firewall, WAF, is, what it can and cannot do, and why deployment, tuning, and governance all matter if you want it to genuinely reduce risk rather than simply generate noise. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A WAF is designed to inspect web requests and responses, which means it focuses on the application layer rather than only on network addresses and ports. Traditional network controls can block traffic from a certain location or restrict which ports are open, but web attacks often hide inside normal-looking traffic on common ports that must remain open for business to work. A WAF steps into that reality by examining the structure and content of web interactions, including parameters, headers, cookies, and request patterns, and then deciding whether to allow, block, or challenge that traffic. The beginner-friendly way to think about it is that a WAF is like a bouncer who does not just check that someone arrived at the door, but also watches how they behave once they start talking, looking for signs of trouble. This is why the WAF can help against common injection and exploitation attempts, even when they arrive through the same front door used by legitimate customers. The important point is that it works best when it is positioned thoughtfully and configured deliberately, because it is only as smart as the rules and context it is given. Deploying a WAF effectively begins with understanding where it belongs in the path of traffic, because placement determines both protection and visibility. Some deployments place the WAF in front of the application so it can see and potentially block requests before they reach the servers, while others place it closer to the application components to watch more internal context. For beginners, the key idea is that the WAF should be positioned where it can reliably observe the full set of web traffic you care about, including the traffic that carries the most sensitive actions, like authentication, account changes, and transaction steps. If you place it in a way that only sees a portion of requests, you create blind spots that attackers can aim for, and you also create a false sense of safety, because the WAF dashboard looks calm while the unobserved pathway stays exposed. Deployment also needs to consider performance and availability, because a WAF becomes part of the user's experience, and a poorly deployed WAF can create latency or outages that tempt teams to bypass it. A solid deployment plan treats the WAF as critical infrastructure, not as a temporary filter that can be switched off whenever it becomes inconvenient. A crucial early decision in deployment is whether the WAF begins in a monitoring mode or a blocking mode, because the risks are different in each approach. Monitoring mode allows the WAF to observe and log suspicious behavior without stopping it, which can be useful when you're learning what normal traffic looks like and when you're trying to avoid accidentally blocking legitimate customers. Blocking mode actively rejects requests that match certain suspicious patterns, which can provide real protection, but it can also create false positives if the rules do not match your application's behavior. Beginners should understand that false positives are not just annoying. They can disrupt business and erode trust in the WAF, causing people to ignore alerts or disable protections. At the same time, leaving a WAF in monitoring mode forever is a common failure, because it turns the control into a passive observer that never actually prevents harm. The practical balance is to start with careful observation, validate what the WAF is seeing, and then move towards selective blocking for the highest confidence threats. When this transition is done intentionally, the WAF becomes both a detection tool and a prevention tool, which is the combination most environments are aiming for. Tuning is the disciplined process of making the WAF's decisions match your real application, and it is where most of the long-term value is created. A WAF typically relies on rules that detect known attack patterns, but real applications also have unique behaviors, such as special parameters, unusual request sizes, or legitimate user flows that look odd to generic rules. Without tuning, the WAF may generate a flood of alerts, many of which are harmless, and that volume can hide the truly important signals. Beginners should connect this to the idea of actionable alerts, because a WAF that cries wolf all day teaches people to stop listening. Tuning involves reviewing alerts, identifying which ones are false positives, and adjusting rules, thresholds, and exceptions so that legitimate traffic is less likely to be flagged. The tricky part is that exceptions must be narrow and justified, because a broad exception can become a permanent hole that attackers can exploit. Done well, tuning makes the WAF quieter and smarter at the same time, which is exactly what you want in a payment environment where attention is limited and accuracy matters. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking that tuning means turning off protections until nothing triggers, but that is not tuning, it is surrender. Real tuning is about aligning detection with risk, which means you keep the protections that matter most and refine how they apply to your specific routes and behaviors. If a particular endpoint handles login attempts, you might keep strong protections there, because it is a high-value target for attackers trying to guess passwords or steal sessions. If another endpoint serves static content, the risk profile is different, and the WAF rules may be simpler. Tuning also includes deciding how the WAF should respond, because blocking is not the only option. Sometimes logging and rate limiting are more appropriate, especially when you are dealing with uncertain signals. Beginners should also realize that tuning changes over time, because applications change, user behavior changes, and attacker techniques evolve. A WAF that was tuned last year can drift out of alignment if new features are added or if traffic patterns shift. Treating tuning as an ongoing practice keeps the WAF from becoming stale, which is essential if you want it to remain effective and credible. One of the most valuable roles of a WAF is protecting against input-based attacks, where an attacker tries to send data that causes the application to behave in unintended ways. Web applications accept input constantly, from form fields to API calls to URL parameters, and attackers often craft input to trigger injection flaws or to confuse parsers and validation logic. A WAF can help by recognizing suspicious patterns, such as attempts to include database commands where a name should be, or attempts to insert script content into fields that should hold plain text. For beginners, it is important to understand that the WAF is looking for patterns and signals, not reading minds, and this is why it can sometimes block legitimate but unusual input. This also explains why developers and security teams must work together, because the WAF needs to understand what inputs are expected for each endpoint to be accurate. When the application's input rules are clear and consistent, the WAF can enforce them more effectively, and it becomes harder for attackers to smuggle dangerous content through normal-looking requests. In a payment context, this matters because a successful input attack can lead to account takeover, transaction manipulation, or data exposure. Another area where WAF controls can matter is session and authentication protection, because the web layer often carries the signals that indicate account abuse. Attackers may try credential stuffing, where they reuse passwords from other breaches, or they may try automated guessing, or they may attempt to hijack sessions by stealing tokens. A WAF can help detect and slow these behaviors by noticing patterns like repeated login failures, repeated attempts across many accounts from one source, or sudden spikes in requests to sensitive endpoints. Beginners should remember that slowing an attacker is valuable even when you cannot block everything, because time creates opportunities for detection and response. A WAF can also help enforce safer behavior by challenging suspicious traffic or limiting request rates, which reduces the ability to test thousands of guesses quickly. At the same time, a WAF cannot fix weak authentication design, and it cannot guarantee that a stolen valid session token will be detected which is why it must be treated as a layer rather than a cure. When tuned and governed well, the WAF becomes part of the broader access control story, reinforcing strong authentication and making abuse harder to scale. Governing a WAF means deciding who owns it, how changes are approved, how exceptions are justified, and how success is measured, because a WAF that is not governed will drift into unsafe patterns. Without governance, teams may add exceptions during an outage and forget to remove them, or they may disable protections when a customer complains, or they may allow rules to change without understanding the risk trade-offs. Beginners should connect this to disciplined change management, because WAF rules are configuration, and configuration changes can weaken security even when they appear to solve short-term problems. Good governance defines roles, such as who can modify rules, who reviews changes, and who verifies that changes did not create broad bypasses. It also defines a process for emergency changes, because urgent situations happen, but urgent changes still need accountability and follow-up. Governance should also define documentation expectations, like recording why an exception exists, what endpoint it applies to, and when it will be reviewed. When governance is real, the WAF remains a security control, not a convenience filter that can be bent into invisibility whenever it becomes uncomfortable. A WAF also needs to be integrated into monitoring in a way that supports action rather than creating constant distraction. The WAF can generate a lot of events, and if those events are not prioritized and correlated, they will feel like background chatter. Beginners should understand that not every blocked request is important, because many are automated probes that happen all the time, but patterns can be important, especially when they focus on sensitive endpoints or coincide with other suspicious events. Effective integration means selecting high-value signals, such as repeated attack patterns against payment-related routes, sudden changes in attack volume, or unusual traffic that appears to bypass normal user behavior. It also means connecting WAF visibility to other logs, so that if an attacker shifts from web probing to credential abuse or internal movement, defenders can see the full story. Another key point is ensuring WAF logs are retained and protected, because if you need to investigate an incident, WAF evidence can help explain what was attempted and what was blocked. When monitoring is tuned, the WAF becomes both a shield and a sensor, and those two roles reinforce each other. It is also important for beginners to understand the limits of what a WAF can do, because overconfidence is one of the fastest ways to create hidden risk. A WAF can help block known patterns and common attacks, but it cannot guarantee protection against every logic flaw, especially flaws that involve legitimate actions used in abusive ways. If an application allows a user to refund their own purchase without proper authorization checks, a WAF may see the request as normal because it looks like a valid action. If an attacker uses stolen credentials and behaves like a normal user, the WAF may not have enough signal to distinguish them reliably from the real account owner. A WAF also cannot replace secure development practices, because preventing vulnerabilities at the source is stronger than attempting to filter every possible bad request. Beginners should treat the WAF as a compensating layer that reduces exposure, slows attackers, and provides visibility, not as a permission slip to ignore secure coding and secure configuration. When teams understand limitations, they deploy and tune with realistic goals, and that realism makes the control stronger rather than weaker. A meaningful WAF program also includes regular review and testing, because you want evidence that the WAF is protecting what you think it is protecting. Over time, applications change, new endpoints appear, and old ones are removed, and a WAF policy that was accurate last quarter can become incomplete today. Review includes confirming that the WAF still covers all exposed web applications and API routes that matter, and that it is still operating in the intended mode for each area. It also includes checking that tuning changes did not accidentally create broad exceptions and that detection rules still match modern attack patterns. Beginners should also understand that attackers adapt, so the pattern of attempts you see this year may not match what you saw last year, which means tuning and rule updates are part of staying effective. A disciplined review cycle ties directly into vulnerability management and change management, because new exposures discovered through scanning or new features introduced through change should influence WAF coverage and policy. When review is consistent, the WAF remains aligned with reality rather than with an outdated picture of reality. Another governance challenge is balancing protection with user experience, because a WAF that blocks legitimate customers can create pressure to loosen controls quickly. Beginners should recognize that this pressure is not always unreasonable, because businesses need transactions to work, but the danger is responding with broad disabling rather than careful adjustment. The mature approach is to use evidence from logs and testing to refine the rules that are causing false positives, and to do so in a narrow way that preserves protection elsewhere. It also helps to design applications with predictable, consistent input patterns, because that predictability makes filtering more accurate. Teams can also segment policies so that the most sensitive routes receive stricter scrutiny, while low-risk routes are handled more gently, which reduces friction without giving up meaningful security. A WAF becomes trusted when it is reliable, and reliability comes from tuning that respects real traffic while still enforcing strong boundaries. When the user experience is considered as part of governance, the WAF is less likely to be bypassed under pressure, which keeps the protection intact when it matters most. The strongest perspective to carry forward is that deploying, tuning, and governing a WAF is not a one-time project, but a continuous security practice that sits alongside development, monitoring, and change control. Deployment ensures coverage and resilience, so web traffic reliably passes through protection and visibility points rather than slipping through side paths. Tuning transforms generic rules into application-aware defenses that reduce noise and improve accuracy without carving dangerous holes. Governance keeps the control consistent by defining ownership, change discipline, exception management, and evidence-based review, so short-term fixes do not become long-term vulnerabilities. When these elements work together, the WAF becomes a practical layer that reduces common web attack success, slows abuse, and helps defenders see what is happening at the edge. In payment environments, where web interfaces frequently touch sensitive workflows, that layered protection can significantly reduce risk and improve incident response confidence. When you treat the WAF as both shield and sensor, and you manage it with discipline, it becomes a reliable part of the security story rather than a noisy box that everyone eventually ignores.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.